As a general rule, I don't enjoy getting into conversations about who the GOAT in any particular sport is. Mostly because I don't really see the point. No matter what the stats say or how good of an argument you can make for them, everyone is going to have their own perspective on who the greatest is and why, and for the most part that's fine. That's part of what makes sports great. But sometimes, an athlete is so dominant and accomplishes so much over the course of their career that there's no real conversation to be had. Michael Phelps is example A for this type of athlete. Over his career, Phelps set the record for most Olympic gold medals won with 23, set nearly 40 world records, and was the most decorated athlete in any sport at 4 consecutive Olympic Games. But even more than that, Phelps was the kind of athlete that moves an entire sport forward. Don't get me wrong, the US has had a really proud tradition of swimming for a really long time, but while Phelps was active, it was on a completely different level in terms of marketability and exposure. In a lot of ways, he was swimming in the same way that Tiger Woods was golf, or the Williams sisters were women's tennis. And in his capacity as part of NBC's broadcast team, he still retains that status as an ambassador for the sport. I usually try and find some sort of sports psychology angle for this sort of thing, and there will be some of that. But unless you're a real swimming sicko, and I know there will be at least a couple of you guys out there who clicked on this video, most of us only get to interact with Olympic athletes once every 4 years. And at the time of recording, it's been 8 years since Michael Phelps' last Olympic Games in Rio. So with that in mind, the main focus of this video is going to be revisiting some of the moments, both good and bad, that helped form this man's legendary career. For almost 2 decades, those of us lucky enough to experience the entire journey got to watch Michael Phelps take on the world in 4 distinct phases, from his dominance as a teenager back in 2004, all the way to his role as the elder statesman of the team in 2016. And before anyone pedantic in the comments tries to correct me, yes, I know that Michael Phelps went to 5 Olympics and not 4, but considering he was a literal child at the Games in Sydney in 2000 and didn't win a medal for the only time in his entire career, we're going to start in Athens. Michael Phelps came into the 2004 Olympics with absolutely insane expectations. He was 19 and had never medaled before, but a lot of the conversation around him going into the Games was about whether or not he could win 8 golds and break Mark Spitz's record from 1972. Speedo, one of Phelps' main sponsors, had even publicly offered him $1 million if he could win 7 and match the record. So yeah, no pressure, kid. And to be fair, Phelps was a phenomenon at that point and had ripped up the World Championships in 2003. But there were real obstacles to him getting anywhere close to 7 gold medals. One of the biggest, both figuratively and literally, was Ian Thorpe, the legendary Australian swimmer that Phelps had modeled much of his early career on. Thorpe was everything that Phelps wanted to be, and in a lot of ways, it made sense to evaluate them in relation to each other. But despite the respect between the two competitors, the Aussies were not overly impressed with those comparisons. Longtime Australian swimming coach and administrator Don Talbot praised Phelps' talent, but also said that those who talk about him in terms of being as great as Ian must be out of their minds. Thorpe himself said that 7 gold medals was unattainable for him or anyone else swimming at those Olympics, all of which came to a head in the so-called race of the century in the 200 free. Phelps had already won his first gold medal in 400 IM earlier that week, but I'm choosing this race, which Phelps did not win, as the moment from the 2004 Olympics, because it shows something about this dude as a competitor. Phelps swam this race against 3 of the fastest freestylers ever: Ian Thorpe, Grant Hackett, and Peter Vanden Hoogenbond, who is an awesome athlete, but I really wanted to make sure I got him in here because his name is super fun to say. And in a field stacked with Olympic medalists, Phelps more than held his own, taking bronze in one of the few races in his career that he was not expected to win. He ended up winning 6 gold medals at that Olympics, just one shy of Spitz's record, but he'd also proven that he was willing to push himself and meet pretty much any challenge put in front of him, both inside or outside of the pool. And that was good, because while Beijing 2008 would prove to be his most successful Olympic Games ever, it would also push him to his physical and mental limits in a way that hadn't been seen before or since. And speaking of having your emotional limits tested, I'd like to take a second to talk about the importance of Aura, the sponsor of today's video. A while back, my wife and I went to an entire series worth of Braves games to celebrate my 30th birthday, and used a popular ticket website for all 3 of them. So you can imagine my surprise to hear that that same popular ticket website was recently hacked, and had data for nearly 560 million of its users put up for sale on the dark web. That includes full names, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, and credit card data just all out there for whoever to bid on. Not great. Businesses like that are all too happy to collect our data, but once they've got it, they don't really do that much to protect it. That's why I use Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura alerts me when my data has been part of a data breach or leaked on the dark web. It gives me fast fraud alerts if anyone tries to use that data to access my credit or bank accounts, and it removes my information from data broker websites so I get less spam. I also get things like transaction monitoring, a VPN, antivirus, a password manager, parental controls, and identity theft insurance. I get all this in one app at one affordable price, so if my info was compromised in the Ticketmaster breach, I wouldn't need to worry. Aura is always on, always doing the hard work keeping me safe, so I can go on enjoying the Braves being slightly above average in peace. If you want peace of mind while watching your team be mediocre, go to aura.com/game to try 2 weeks for free, or click the link in the description. Okay, back to Michael Phelps. At 23, Phelps came into the 2008 Games in Beijing as the unquestioned best swimmer in the world, but his plan to try and break Spitz's record meant that he was going to be swimming 17 times in 9 days, and in every single one of those races, both he and his teammates were going to be getting everyone's best shot. If he wanted 8 golds, there would be essentially zero margin for error, and that got tested almost immediately. In just his second race of the weekend, Phelps swam the first leg of the 4x100 free relay, a race that the French team, anchored by world record holder Alain Bernard, were strongly favored to win. And they've been talking some mad shit about it too. It's important to point out here that Michael Phelps definitely has some of that Michael Jordan and I took that personally quality about him when it comes to motivating himself. He once put a picture of Ian Crocker, his own teammate, in his locker when he beat his world record in the 100 fly. But when you've got someone talking about how their team is going to smash yours, you don't have to work that hard to find some bulletin board material. In one of the most famous moments in recent Olympic history, American swimmer Jason Lezak reeled in a tiring Bernard in the last leg of the relay, beating him to the wall by 0.08 of a second and winning the gold medal for the US. That's not really a Phelps moment so much as a team one, but I really didn't think I could make this video in good faith without at least mentioning it. I've watched this video about 1,000 times and it never really gets old. The real Phelps moment came a few days later in the final of the 100 fly. This was an event that Phelps had won in 2004 and set an Olympic record in the process. But in a short race like this, everyone is going to be extremely fast and the margins are always going to be extremely fine. The biggest threat to Phelps appeared to be Serbian Milorad Kabic, who posted the top time in both the qualifying heats and semifinals, but had also made the crucial mistake of saying that Phelps losing would be good for him and the sport, and that Kabic wouldn't be the guy to make it happen.
Dumbass!
He was probably right in some sense, but like I mentioned a second ago, this is not the kind of guy you want to give any more motivation to beat to than he already has. And as the race began, Kabic more than backed up his words, posting an absolutely scorching 23.42 in his first 50, and leading Phelps by almost an entire body length coming out of the turn. But getting out ahead of Michael Phelps is one thing, it's the beating him back to the wall, it's the hard part. Under slightly controversial circumstances, Phelps caught up to Kabic and timed his approach to the wall absolutely perfectly, winning the race by 1/100th of a second. Both in the sense of the Olympic medals record and the people he was in races with, Phelps was good at coming from behind. And a day later, because again this schedule was absolutely insane, Phelps and his teammates won the 4x100 medley relay to break the record. 8 gold medals at one Olympics. It was a feat of speed, dominance, and endurance that will in all likelihood never be matched. But remember when I said that it would take everything Phelps had to do it, and then probably some more on top of that? Well, it did, and the fallout from those games nearly ended his swimming career altogether. One of my biggest takeaways from reading Michael Phelps' biography was how image conscious he was, especially early on in his career. He was swimming's golden boy, and everyone involved was making an absolute ton of money off of that, and thus had a vested interest in making sure he stayed that way. So you can imagine that when in November 2008, just a few months after that last gold medal win, Phelps was photographed smoking a bong at a party, it did not go down super well, either with his team or his adoring public. And while attitudes about that sort of thing have shifted a lot in the 15 years since, to the point that I don't think it would be nearly as big of a deal if it happened today, I'd still think it's worth talking about. In his career after swimming, one of Michael Phelps' biggest contributions has been advocating for the mental health of Olympic athletes, specifically as it pertains to what happens to them after the games are over. Pretty much across the board, Olympic athletes are absolute sickos. They are competitionaholics, and the only thing sustaining that level of commitment that it takes to stay at that level is the idea of getting to compete for a medal. So what happens when the games end and all of that goes away? Nothing good. Massive shifts in daily routines, decreased social interactions with peers, barriers to typical sources of neurotransmitters like dopamine and oxytocin. All of these are classic environmental triggers for conditions like depression and anxiety. And in Michael Phelps' case, he may have been particularly vulnerable. I don't usually talk about this sort of thing because it's not really my place to speculate, but in this case, Michael Phelps has been very open about his early diagnosis of ADHD and how that's affected both his swimming and other areas of his life. And as a person who also has an ADHD diagnosis and researches and teaches this kind of stuff for a living, I can tell you that this kind of post-Olympic lapse, which Phelps would struggle with multiple times over the course of his career, is 100% on brand for that sort of brain. ADHD brains need near constant stimulation to regulate themselves, which makes something like a very busy daily swimming schedule and a goal to work towards pretty ideal. But take that away and you might find yourself feeling pretty listless and out of sorts and looking for ways to fill that gap, which in my opinion is how someone might wind up in a situation like this. Listening to him talk about how he felt after 2008, I think it's pretty clear that Phelps was experiencing some pretty acute levels of burnout. He almost never took a single day off, but in the build-up to the 2012 Olympics in London, he just kind of disappeared for about 10 days after he got in an argument with his coach, Bob Bowman. In his own words, he did what he described as the bare minimum to get himself ready for the Olympics, because he didn't want to train anymore. He was mostly just doing it because of sponsorship commitments and because he felt like that was what he was supposed to do. But despite that lack of motivation, Michael Phelps still qualified for the exact same 8 events that he competed in Beijing, and entered the Games in London with the opportunity to become the first male swimmer ever to win the same event at 3 straight Olympics, which he then did in not 1, but 2 separate events. Even barely caring, Michael Phelps was still good enough to win 4 gold medals and 2 silvers, and then announce his retirement from swimming almost as soon as the Games were over. But if you've been paying attention, you'll know that we're going through 4 Michael Phelps moments in this video, and so far, we've only done 3, which means that he wasn't as done as he might have thought. 2016 in Rio would end up being Phelps' redemption tour, but before that happened, he would need to do something that he needed to be redeemed for. In September 2014, just a few months after coming out of retirement, Michael Phelps was arrested and given 18 months of supervised probation for DUI. This was actually Phelps' second DUI since he turned pro, the first of which came back in 2004, a few months after, stop me if you've heard this before, the Olympics ended. People in his circle weren't concerned for his swimming career so much as they were concerned for his personal well-being, or even his life, which is probably not something you'd expect to hear in a story about someone's career highlights, but I think it makes what I'm about to say in a minute that much more impressive. Phelps' issues in the lead up to the 2016 Games weren't so much about his physical capability as they were about his identity. There's a lot of podcast and YouTube video material out there of him talking about this, and I would encourage you to go look it up, but he said repeatedly that for a long time, he was kept in a little Olympic swimming bubble. But once he grew up and had to leave that bubble behind, he had to figure out who he was again, and it wasn't going smoothly. The DUI in 2014 was another situation where he dug himself into a hole that he'd have to come back from. Another challenge that he'd have to push himself to meet, but as we've learned, that's kind of Michael Phelps' thing. Here's a question for you. Why would Michael Phelps come back to the Olympics at all at that point? He'd already done more in the sport than anyone could have possibly dreamed, so what more was there to get out of it? Those are the logical questions to ask, but I also think they're the wrong ones. Michael Phelps did come back to the Rio Olympics to do something he'd never done before, but it was to do the Olympics on his own terms. In his own words, this was the first Olympics that people got to see who he was, and if you watch him at these games compared to the ones in the past, it kind of shows. For the first time in his entire career, Michael Phelps got to attend the opening ceremony of the Rio Olympics in person, and not only that, he was also Team USA's flag bearer. This was the first, but not the last, indication that his role in the team had changed, and so had he. These Olympics were not going to be about being in the zone or chasing a medal record or anything like that. He was coming to Rio as the captain of the US swim team for the first time. He'd just gotten married and become a dad too, and his wife and son were there to watch him. The teenager who'd idolized Ian Thorpe and wanted to redefine swimming in the US was gone, and the grown-up version of Michael Phelps, the one that we see on NBC's Olympics coverage now, was coming to the fore. But funnily enough, he was still super good at a lot of the same races. I mentioned earlier that Michael Phelps was the first male swimmer to win the same event at 3 consecutive Olympics. Well, in 2016, he became the only swimmer, period, to win the same event 4 times in a row, when he won the 200 IM final, setting an Olympic record at age 31 in the process. Phelps came out of the Rio Olympics with 6 more medals, 5 golds and a silver, to add to his collection, which would have been plenty impressive on their own. But especially when you consider where he'd come from to get to that point, and his age relative to his competitors, this is absolutely amazing. You can say what you want about 2008, but for me, 2016 is my favorite version of Michael Phelps, because while I enjoy watching people dominate on that kind of stage, especially American people, watching them do it with a smile on their face and in a way that's mentally healthy is just better. How we perceive athletes is usually by their legacy or their history, and Michael Phelps has the greatest legacy in the history of swimming, and it's not particularly close. The second most decorated male swimmer ever is Mark Spitz with 9 gold medals, and Michael Phelps has 23. And it's easy to see that and think, there's his legacy right there. But each one of those 23 gold medals come from an individual moment that each have their own individual story. 2 of those golds were won by a combined 0.05 of a second, and many of them wouldn't have happened without world-class teammates like Jason Lezak. Especially as we get further away from their actual career, it's worth going back through and looking at all the pieces that get stitched together to form how we remember someone as an athlete. Because if you do that, you'll get a much clearer picture of the whole by looking at the parts themselves. All of these Olympics were so different, and Phelps was different going into each one of them too. He started off as a 15-year-old who was just kind of happy to be there, then grew into the most dominant swimmer in the world, and evolved into a role model and representative for the sport whose impact is still being felt in a very real way. The 4 phases of Phelps each show a different side to a very complex individual, and I'd like to think that there's something to be learned from every one of them. Whether it's the importance of determination, passion, motivation, or even forgiveness, the career of Michael Phelps has a lot to teach the athletes and engineers and teachers of the future, and honestly of the present too. And I, for one, am very thankful that it happened the way that it did. Hi everybody, my name is Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game. We have honest but considerate conversations about sports psychology and culture. I love the Olympics and have a very soft spot for Olympic swimming, so when the chance presented itself to do a video about Michael Phelps, aka the Baltimore Bullet, aka the Flying Fish, aka the Phantom of the Aqua, I jumped at it like a guy coming off the blocks to swim the 100 free, which is to say fast, because that's not that long of a race. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it, and be sure to leave a comment with your favorite Olympic moment, Michael Phelps adjacent or otherwise. I hope you enjoy the rest of the games in Paris, but until next time, I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game. Bye!